Okay, yesterday in my video, I mentioned that despite being someone who reads daily Putin's words and speeches and interviews, he gives many interviews to the Russian media, that even I, who have become very accustomed to listening, to reading what Putin has to say, was getting swept along by all the excitement surrounding Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin. And sure enough, the interview has come, and I've listened, and watched it, and have read it, and have come to my own various views about him. And I think it would be remiss of me not to make comments about this interview at the start of this program. I would say that for a more detailed discussion of this interview, you should go to the Duran, where Alex Christoforou and I have done a dedicated video discussing the topic of Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin. I will now, however, make a few general observations, or rather not general observations, in some cases specific observations. Let me begin with the first, which is about Tucker Carlson himself. I thought that he conducted the interview with immense skill and courtesy. It was the best interview with Putin, certainly by an American journalist that I have read or listened to. Tucker Carlson, unlike most journalists, actually seemed interested in what Putin had to say. He did ask Putin hard questions. Putin answered those questions. Tucker Carlson didn't interrupt or contradict Putin or try to put Putin in an embarrassing and humiliating position, as so many Western journalists who've interviewed Putin in the past have sought to do. And as a result, Western viewers, people who watched this interview, would have got a measure of Putin, the person and the politician, and a sense of his thinking and of the kind of arguments that he makes. Now, from Putin's side, I'm going to make a number of observations of my own. He was, again, came across as comfortable, self-confident. He had all the facts at his fingertips. He was at times able to laugh, and he gave a coherent and clear account of all the various things that he wanted to say. And importantly, he answered Tucker Carlson's questions, which again, some people who are interviewed choose not to do. He was at no point, at any point in the interview, evasive. When he wasn't able to give Tucker Carlson information, he explained why. However, I have to say, speaking as someone who is often, criticized for being slow and prolix and taking too much time to explain things, that I think that Putin will have tested the patience of many Western viewers by the seemingly interminable discussion of Russian-Ukrainian history with which he started the interview. And I can imagine some people's eyes glazing and other people drifting off as Putin went into immense, I thought, excessive detail, making the points that he was saying, talking about dates from long ago, which, frankly, I doubt that most Americans or Europeans are interested in. Well, that, however, is characteristic of Putin. He is a deeply historically minded man, and it's perhaps important to say that he is the leader of a country that is also very historically minded as well. One of the things I have regularly found in my interactions with Russians is the depth of historical knowledge that appears to exist amongst them about their own history and their deep interest in it. So this long lecture that Putin gave on the history of Russian-Ukrainian interactions would have been of interest to Russians, to Westerners less so. It's perhaps understandable that Putin, not accustomed to these sort of interviews, perhaps didn't understand this fully. But anyway, it was clearly something he felt an urgent need to do. He had to get it off his chest, and he had to get it off his chest at the start of the interview, and it was what he did. Anyway, those who waited patiently and got through that lecture, and judging by the number of views and likes that appear on social media, that does appear to have been an awful lot of people, will nonetheless have found, I think, the rest of the interview extremely impressive. Putin had all the facts at his fingertips. As I said, he was able to answer Tucker Carlson's questions. He gave very interesting accounts of his many interactions with Western leaders. He made it clear again and again how patiently and for how long the Russians tried to seek positive interactions with the West, how they repeatedly felt that they'd been led up the garden path, that they'd been given promises that NATO would not be extended eastward, which it was, how they had themselves opened up the issue, well, he himself opened up the question of perhaps Russia itself joining NATO, only to have that slammed, that idea shot down. How when Russia sought other means to find some kind of modus vivendi with the United States and with the West, that failed to happen. How how the arms control treaties painstakingly negotiated collapsed. The concerns he feels about the way in which the United States went back on the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and the way in which the US showed no understanding or interest in Russian concerns, and again also the complex, immensely difficult, and for the Russians, dismal history of the negotiations concerning Ukraine, the decision to invite Ukraine to join NATO, made at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, the way in which the Germans and the French assured Putin at that meeting, where he was himself present, that they didn't really mean that this invitation should happen, but that they were placed under immense pressure by George W. Bush. Putin responding to that by saying that if the Americans placed that pressure on them at the Bucharest summit, they would again place the Europeans under the same pressure. Later, when the time came for Ukraine to join NATO, and if they succumbed to American pressure in Bucharest, then they would, of course, succumb to American pressure again. And there's no sign that Western leaders, the French and German leaders, were able to give him any coherent answers. And he also discussed the story of the Minsk agreement, the fact that the Ukrainians openly sabotaged it, the fact that the Germans and the French sat by and let that happen, the steady collapse in relations between Russia and the West, and what Putin sees as the perennially aggressive policies that post-Maidan governments have followed towards the people of Donbass, which eventually exploded into outright war, first in 2014, and then again, as far as he's concerned, in 2022. So this was Putin setting it all out, setting it in great detail, talking about the intense pressure that the Russians feel they have come under from the West, and the way in which ultimately it was the West that drove relations into the point of crisis where they are now. And interestingly, Putin also disclosed that in various interactions with Western leaders, he repeatedly warned them that they were making mistakes, that they were making a grave mistake to disregard Russian interests and Russian concerns over NATO, that doing so, the expansion of NATO, that doing so would inevitably, in the end, result in a crisis, that their constant spurning of Russia would result in a crisis. He said that Western policies, the attempt to use the dollar as an instrument of economic war, was also a massive mistake, given US dependence on the dollar, the international position of the dollar, both to secure its own current prosperity and as a mechanism for establishing US global influence. And he made it, I think, fairly clear, in fact abundantly clear, that he had no time and patience any longer for Western leaders, especially European leaders, who he clearly has become utterly exasperated and impatient towards. I thought he made an interesting distinction, by the way, between the leaderships of Europe, which he sees as broken and ineffective and essentially in thrall to the United States, and some of the political leaders of the United States. He spoke surprisingly warmly, for example, about George W. Bush, with whom he says he had a good personal relationship. But he went out of his way to say that, again, repeatedly, he thought he had come to understandings with Western leaders, for example, about NATO membership for Russia with Bill Clinton, the possibility of developing joint anti-ballistic missile systems with George W. Bush, only for whatever the president appeared to have agreed with him to be repudiated by the president's officials, who always seemed, in the end, to pursue an uncompromising policy towards Russia. In those words, in speaking in that way, Putin reminded me very much of Xi Jinping's virtual meeting with President Biden. I think it was last year or the year before, in which Xi Jinping told Biden to his face that the president, Biden himself, on the topic of Taiwan, says one thing, but the administration continues to do something completely different. Clearly, the Russians and the Chinese have compared notes about this. That was the other thing that came across clearly from this interview. Putin made absolutely clear that the friendship with China is not up for discussion with anyone in the West or with the United States. Anyway, it's clear to me that the Chinese and the Russians have compared notes and have discussed with each other the impossibility of reaching long-term agreements with the United States, or indeed with the Europeans, on any issue, because what they are told in private and what they think they have agreed in private is not acted upon by the Western governments concerned, and Western governments anyway constantly and incessantly go back on their promises. That, at least it seemed to me, was Putin's perspective on relations with the West. Now, he did disclose certain very interesting things. He went a bit further on some points than I've seen him do, and he made, I thought, three very interesting points. The most important one, the one that matters perhaps most pertinently, was in what he had to say about Ukraine and giving an indication of how the war might end. Now, he was very clear, and he repeatedly said that the Russians are prepared to sit down and conduct negotiations. And he also made it clear that these negotiations can take place, as far as the Russians are concerned, without preconditions, which is not to say that the Russians themselves do not have clear ideas about where negotiations might go. To the extent that there are no negotiations underway at present, it is entirely the fault of the West and of Ukraine. President Zelensky has even issued a decree prohibiting himself and Ukrainian officials from conducting negotiations with the Russians. And Putin makes the obvious point that until and unless that decree is cancelled or set aside, it is ridiculous to talk about negotiations. But he did give a fairly clear idea of where negotiations would have to go if they are to fulfill Russian concerns. And again, it was absolutely clear to me that any arrangement which allowed Ukraine to enter NATO is completely unacceptable from a Russian point of view. But he also made it fairly clear that he regards all territory east of the Dnieper River, which would include places like the cities of Zaporozhye and Kharkiv and Sumy and Chernigov. He considers these to be Russian territories. And given how he feels about the transfer of Russian territories by the Soviet government to Ukraine, something which he again expressed his personal views about at great, perhaps even inordinate length, I personally cannot see, based on his comments, any situation whereby he agrees to a peace which leaves the historic Russian territories east of the Dnieper still under Ukrainian control. Now, he didn't mention Odessa, which is, of course, on the Black Sea coast and west of the Dnieper, but I can't help but think that following through on his own logic, given what he said about historic Russian territories and the way in which he invoked the memory of Catherine the Great, I can't myself see how, if things are allowed to take their course, he won't see Odessa also as a Russian city. And if his armies reach Odessa, which they might quite plausibly do, that he won't insist on Odessa falling under Russian control in some form as well. But I'm going to issue a further warning, which is that Putin's constant reiteration that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, very fully set out over the course of this interview, open up further possibilities. If there is no negotiated solution, if the war does not end, if the Russians control all the territory east of the Dnieper, but find that they are obliged to cross the Dnieper as part of because the war continues, then, given that Putin clearly considers Ukrainians to be Russians of a sort, he even mentioned an incident where Ukrainian soldiers had been surrounded by Russian troops during the special military operation, were asked to surrender and refused to do so in Russian, saying that Russians refused to surrender. Given that this is how Putin feels about Ukrainians, if the Russians get to Zhytomyr or Cherkasy or some place like that, let alone Kiev or Dnipro, is it realistic to think that he's simply going to say, these territories, they can go their own way, they're not Russian, I'm not interested in them, let them go? I don't know. He's a sophisticated man, and as he was as pains to say, he is also, in terms of geopolitics, a realist. Probably, possibly, he would come to an agreement. But that presupposes that the Western powers and whatever government still represents Ukraine would in that case be prepared to negotiate with him. In the absence of such an agreement, I think the possibility of some kind of process of unification, as Putin would call it, or wider annexation, incorporating territories west of the Dnieper, cannot be excluded at all. So I think I do want to say that, and that makes it even more imperative that serious, substantive negotiations begin at once and without delay, and at least if the desire still exists to preserve an independent Ukraine, which, to be frank, on the part of some people in the West, I'm starting myself to doubt. But anyway, let's move on. He did again float the possibility, though he made it very clear that he's never discussed this with Orban, that some territories which historically belonged to Poland and Hungary and Romania might rejoin those countries. He didn't say anything new there, but he did say some very interesting things about other matters. The first is that he returned to the topic of the Istanbul agreements. And very interestingly, and for the first time, as far as I know, he actually said that the Istanbul agreements, the ones that were reached in March 2022, actually included provisions which Ukraine agreed to, these are draft agreements, of course, addressing the problem of denazification in Ukraine. He didn't spell out what these agreements were, but in the past, Ukrainian officials have sort of denied this. And it seems, from what Putin has said, that in fact, in reality, in private, in their discussions with the Russians, they actually agreed to it. That is an interesting fact in itself. It suggests that in face-to-face meetings with the Russians, Ukrainian negotiators and perhaps President Zelensky himself, did acknowledge that Ukraine has a problem, though of course it's not something that the Ukrainians since then have acknowledged, and in fact Zelensky and his officials, since the collapse of the Istanbul negotiations, have effectively embraced people who hold these ideologies. So that's one thing that came out of this interview, which was new and connected to the Istanbul agreement. But Putin did reveal something else, and it was very interesting and completely new. And as far as I'm aware, the only other person who spotted it is Valterson. I noticed it even as the interview was underway, but Valterson noticed it as well and has also commented on its significance. Anyway, Putin made this comment, and this connects to the question of the Russian withdrawal from Kiev. He said this: "My counterparts in France, in Germany, said, how can you imagine them," that's to say the Ukrainians, "signing a treaty with a gun to their heads? The troops," he means the Russian troops, "should be pulled back from Kiev." I said, all right. We withdrew the troops from Kiev. As soon as we did so, our Ukrainian negotiators almost immediately threw all our agreements reached in Istanbul into the bin and prepared for a long-running armed confrontation with the help of the United States and its satellites in Europe. Now, in the past, the Russians have said that Putin agreed or decided to withdraw the troops from Kiev as a goodwill gesture. A few months ago, the Russians started to say that they withdrew the troops from Kiev following a request from the Ukrainians. Putin has now gone a whole step further than that, and he has disclosed, or at least claimed, that this request from Kiev, from the Ukrainian government, for Russian troops to be withdrawn from around Kiev, that this was backed by the governments of Germany and France. And note that Putin specifically refers to my counterparts in France, in Germany. He means, in other words, Macron and Scholz. Macron and Scholz asked Putin to withdraw Russian troops from around Kiev, and he agreed in order to enable the Ukrainians to move forward with the Istanbul Accords. And he said that the moment he did that, the moment he pulled the troops back, the Ukrainians responded by binning the Istanbul Accords. And he mentions and discusses at some length and with a certain amount of derision the role that Boris Johnson played. But anyway, Boris Johnson's role is one which I've discussed many times in many programs. This revelation from Putin that the French and the Germans, Scholz and Macron, played a role in getting Russian troops to pull back from Kiev, that, to my knowledge, is new. And as I said, Valterson has grasped the significance of that. I don't think anyone else has. The point is that Putin clearly feels that not for the first time he was double-crossed. He did something that the Germans and the French asked him to do. He did that as a goodwill gesture. to facilitate the completion of negotiations, and he was again betrayed. And I can't help but think, after this, that the prospects of Putin believing or trusting in anything that the Germans and the French, especially Macron and Scholz, puts to him, that after that, that prospect has all but collapsed. I can't see him trusting the Germans and the French, Macron and Scholz, again. Well, I would just add something further. We've had endless claims, reports, newspaper articles, commentaries, descriptions about the great Ukrainian military victory in the battle for Kiev, the way the Ukrainians supposedly drove the Russians back from Kiev, something, by the way, which does not at all recall with my recollections of what was actually happening around Kiev. In fact, my recollection is that there was relatively little fighting going on around Kiev at all. The Russians were there. There was occasional clashes with the Ukrainians. The Russians were actually taking more territory. They even captured a town where people from Chernobyl had been evacuated to by the Soviet Union shortly before this pullback was agreed. But overall, there was nothing like the kind of intense clashes we're seeing in the Donbass now. But anyway, putting all that aside, there was no great battle for Kiev, no great military victory in Kiev. The Russians took the political decision to withdraw, and the French and the Germans, who it turns out had a role in this, they allowed the mythology of the great Ukrainian victory around Kiev to take root in Western commentary, knowing that that mythology is untrue. Just saying. Anyway, there was a third revelation, and again, it was squirreled in to some of the things Putin had to say about the Nord Stream affair. He talked about the fact that it was the Germans, not the Russians, who had cut themselves off from Russian gas. Chancellor Scholz recently has taken to making really astonishing claims that it was the Russians who cut off supplies of gas to Germany. Anyway, Putin has said that technically there are still pipelines. Russian gas could still be supplied to Germany if the Germans took that decision, but apparently they've decided not to. But he had something else to say, which was about the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. And Tucker Carlson asked him who did it, and Putin said it was the US, and Tucker Carlson asked him, how do you know that? And Putin said, well, there was motive. The US had a compelling motive to do it, and it had the capability. But then he gave a very obvious hint that the Russians have information, further information, that they've obtained through their intelligence. And Tucker asked him a little bit to enlarge on that, and Putin said, no, I'm not going to do that. Doing so would disclose our sources, it would compromise our sources, and it wouldn't achieve anything of any political utility anyway, because the United States and the Western powers possess an effective information monopoly in the West, and any information that we gave out compromising our sources in the process would have no effective political effect. I thought that was, again, an interesting exchange. My overall take on this interview is that Putin has become completely disillusioned with the West. He doesn't believe that it is agreement capable. He is determined to resolve the situation in Ukraine in a way that will ensure Russian national interests. He is extremely wary of further negotiations with the Western powers, though he is careful not to shut the door on them. But my own impression, straightforwardly, is that he expects that this conflict is now going to be resolved on the battlefields. And I think after what he said, it is all but inconceivable that the Russians will accept anything less than control of all territories east of the Dnieper, probably at least some kind of control of Odessa and the remaining areas west of the Dnieper on the Black Sea. And as I said, if there's no negotiations, no agreements of any kind, then it might even go beyond that. That is my own take on what Putin said. There was a sense of resignation about a lot of Putin's comments. He clearly is still someone who does not want a permanent confrontation with the West, but he sees that there is now no alternative, and he clearly believes that this confrontation that we are in at the moment will remain. He seemed very skeptical that any new president in the United States would be able to change policy in any significant way. So that was my overall take on his interview. A resigned Putin, resigned to a long confrontation with the United States and the West, and one very much focused on achieving victory on the battlefields in Ukraine, but one who is always careful never to shut the door completely on possible negotiations. So that's my take on Putin's interview. Now, Putin was busy yesterday, obviously. Well, I believe actually the interview took place several days before, but we heard and saw a lot of Putin yesterday with this interview with Tucker Carlson. But of course, the other big news yesterday is the news from Kiev. And this, of course, is news that has more immediate bearing on what is happening on the battlefronts. And that is the final definitive sacking of General Zaluzhny. This protracted, exhausting saga has now finally been, well, sort of resolved. Zelensky has finally publicly sacked Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny is out of a job. It's said that he's still on the team, but there's been no announcement as to what job he's been given. Something which makes me actually wonder whether he's in reality been given any sort of job at all. But his replacement is not Kirill Budanov, which must have come as a relief to most Ukrainian commanders and soldiers, given that Budanov, as I said, is clearly unfit to exercise any command role. It is General Syrsky instead. And if you read Western responses, if you read Ukrainian responses to this appointment, one gets the sense of an overwhelming groan. Syrsky, it is clear, is a deeply unpopular officer. I read somewhere comments about how he's an erudite pedant with no imagination, about his General 200, which is a way of saying that he's a general who's under whose leadership casualties are guaranteed to be monstrously high, how he's the general who lost Solidar and Bakhmut, and who probably will soon lose Kupiansk, how he led the Ukrainian forces to disaster in the Battle of Debaltseve back in 2015, how, in other words, he's lost every important battle that he has fought, that he's deeply unpopular with Ukrainian soldiers, how he's not even Ukrainian, that he's actually Russian. And it is true, he was born in the town of Vladimir in central Russia. His parents are still alive. His father was an officer in the Soviet army. General Syrsky himself received military training in the Soviet Union. He trained as an officer, which, by the way, almost certainly means that he was a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, just saying, that he served in places like Afghanistan as an artillery officer, that, in other words, he's a veteran of the Soviet military. So he's not Russian, he's an ex-communist, probably, an ex-Soviet officer. He's unpopular with the troops, he's rigid and unimaginative, and has presided over one military debacle after another. All of which is probably true, in fact, is essentially true. But I would say that it seems to be intended also to paint Zaluzhny in a more favorable light than he deserves. The one sort of success that Ukraine has had over the course of this war was the Kharkiv offensive of the autumn of 2022. And there was a disclosure yesterday in the Daily Telegraph that Zaluzhny opposed this offensive in the autumn of 2022. He opposed the Kharkiv offensive because he wanted to focus on attacks on Crimea and presumably Kherson region. I remember Gordon Hahn, the analyst and commentator, pointing this out back in 2022 in an article in his all but indispensable blog. Anyway, so Zaluzhny opposed this offensive, and apparently it was Syrsky who wanted this offensive to be carried out and who headed this offensive. And despite the enormous losses and Zaluzhny's view that this offensive only achieved cosmetic gains, which I would generally agree with, by the way, nonetheless, it remains the only bright spot that I could see in the way in which Ukraine has conducted its military campaign up to now. And, well, it seems as if the general who advocated for it and who led it was Syrsky and not Zaluzhny. If you look at everything else that Zaluzhny has done, the Kherson offensive of autumn 2022, the truly disastrous summer offensive of 2023, well, it suddenly seems to me as if Zaluzhny's military skills and supposed success, really, there isn't really much evidence for it. I can't help but think that the real reason why Zaluzhny is popular is because he has apparently a rather affable personality. The Daily Telegraph said that he was a comedian almost to the same level as Zelensky himself is. He's constantly joking and playing the buffoon, sometimes apparently to the irritation of some of the officers, whereas Syrsky is a rather stern, unbending, morose figure. But anyway, a sense of affability. The fact that Zaluzhny himself is an ethnic Ukrainian, one of the relatively few who are apparently in the very highest commands of the Ukrainian army, or at least that was the case, that was true until a few years ago. And lastly, that as a relatively young officer, the whole of his training and experience in the military, in the Ukrainian military, has been since the Soviet Union's collapse, and is therefore entirely uncontaminated by the historic legacy, the historic connections with the Soviet Union and with Russia. And of course, Zaluzhny himself has gone out of his way to court that. He keeps portraits of Bandera in his office. He's been seen in close proximity with members of right sector. He's worn bracelets with interesting symbols, referencing back events of the 1930s and 40s. He's supposedly supported or given reinforcements and supplies to the various military units within the Ukrainian armed forces, which are of a more strongly nationalist orientation. And he seems to be aligned in Ukrainian politics with people like Petro Poroshenko and the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, who, of course, were direct participants in the Maidan events of 2013, 2014, in which Zelensky obviously had no part. So, just saying, I wonder whether it's that background, rather than his own achievements on the battlefronts, that have explain Zaluzhny's popularity and the fact that the soldiers like him. Because if we are talking about achievements on the battlefronts, in Zaluzhny's case, I don't really see that there's much evidence for them. He played, as I said, a determining role in getting the truly disastrous offensive of last summer off the ground. He was advocating for it in the summer of 2022. He set out the weapons that he wanted in order to execute it in an interview he gave to The Economist in the autumn of 2022. He was in overall command of it throughout 2023. He's tried to shift the blame onto other people. And a former NATO official has told me in private that a general in Zaluzhny's situation who had conducted an offensive like that, if he'd actually been serving in a NATO military, would almost certainly have been cashiered. So I make these points about Zaluzhny, I think, as some kind of corrective. I nonetheless also think that Syrsky is entirely the wrong person to lead the Ukrainian military at this time. It seems to me that the decision not to go for Budanov almost certainly was the correct one. You clearly need a military officer, a proper military officer, to command troops in a complex war like this. But throughout this war, Syrsky has been both recklessly aggressive at the cost of huge losses to his men, and he has also been extremely unwilling to the point of pig-headedness in retreating from undefendable positions. And there are reports, for example, that rather than retreat, rather than pull Ukrainian troops out of Avdiivka, as supposedly Zaluzhny wants to do, Syrsky, who is now overall commander, wants to commit more of Ukraine's best troops to trying to reverse the situation in Avdiivka and to holding ground there. Well, as it happens, we've had a certain amount of information from Avdiivka, and I'm not going to go into the huge detail about this, but all I will say is that the Ukrainian situation in Avdiivka is deteriorating from what I can see by the hour. There are large Russian forces concentrated around Avdiivka. The Russians have managed to interrupt Ukrainian communications. They're able to bomb Ukrainian troops. They've developed, as I said, extreme coordination between their air force and their ground forces. I discussed that in my program yesterday. Heavy bombing of Ukrainian positions, massive losses of Ukrainian positions. I've seen that Valterson has also expressed absolute dismay at the idea that the Ukrainians might want to, well, Syrsky might want to try to reverse what is now the irreversible disaster that is Avdiivka. That instead of taking the essential step of trying to find means to pull troops back out of Avdiivka, his plan to send reinforcements there is almost certain to lead to disaster. I've seen, surprisingly enough, similar concerns expressed in places like The Economist, not specifically about Avdiivka, but altogether about Syrsky's tactics. And altogether, given that the Russians have, over the last few months, been conducting in Ukraine a strategy of aggressive attrition, it seems to me that they now have, leading the forces of Ukraine, precisely the general they would have wanted in order to make aggressive attrition even more effective than it has been up to now. Syrsky's persistent habit of reinforcing failure is going to play directly into Russia's plans. Well, we are going to see how things are going to turn out. I'm going to make another suggestion as well about the change that Syrsky might affect. It's become fairly obvious to me over the course of last year that there was an effective division of responsibilities between Zaluzhny and Syrsky. By the way, it's well known that the two don't like each other, but then again, of course, nobody, as we know, particularly likes General Syrsky. But Syrsky has his connections, and he is apparently Ukraine's most experienced military leader, and it was impossible to completely shunt him to one side. So Zaluzhny, as overall military commander, took general responsibility for Ukrainian operations in the south, along the Black Sea, and in southern Donbass. He is responsible for the defenses in places like Vuhledar, and he was the person, obviously, who conducted the grand offensive last year that was intended to reach the Sea of Azov, and he was probably the man who was in overall control of Ukraine's Kherson offensive of the autumn of 2022, and who is probably the person responsible for this renewed attempt, disastrous attempt, to send Ukrainian troops across the Dnieper River into the Russian-controlled part of Kherson region on the east bank of the Dnieper, which has led to the disaster in Krinky. So Zaluzhny's interests were very much in the south, partly because of Zaluzhny's very evident and obvious obsession with Crimea, which, by the way, he seems to have managed, well, he either took from some American officers or perhaps one American officers too. Just saying. Syrsky, by contrast, has been running things in the north. In Bakhmut, in Kupiansk, in Liman. That was, of course, where he conducted the successful offensive of the autumn of 2022, and where he disastrously failed to defend Bakhmut last year, and where he is, to all appearances, failing now. So it could be that, given that Syrsky is more interested in the situation in the north, on the northern front lines, that he will shift Ukraine's major military effort towards the north, towards trying to hold the Russians back in Kharkiv region, where there is increasing talk of a major Russian offensive being prepared, perhaps across the border towards the town of Vovchansk, and also with the Russians piling on the pressure along towards the Oskol River line. In that case, perhaps we will see fewer ventures like the Krinky bridgehead and a reduced emphasis on conducting the war in the Black Sea. Anyway, we will see. In the Black Sea area. Anyway, we will see. But overall, I do think, as I said, this is a bad choice. But who else was there? I had speculated at one time that General Tarnavsky might be the person who might conceivably take Zaluzhny's place. He's, of course, the commander of the Tavrida forces, which were supposed to break through in Zaporozhye. It's clear that he has been badly damaged. His reputation has been badly damaged by that failure. And it's also clear that he's deeply loyal to his immediate boss, who was Zaluzhny. I wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if Tarnavsky is going to be sacked soon as well. Overall, this is a bad appointment. As I said, it facilitates the Russian plan of aggressive attrition. And besides, it doesn't address Ukraine's underlying problems, which is that it is massively outmatched by Russia at every level. And that, as Putin said to Tucker Carlson over the course of the interview, Putin's interview, there is no way, there is no route for Russia, for Ukraine, to win the war. So, shuttling around generals, talking about new plans, is not going to change the underlying dynamics on the battlefield. It cannot change the industrial, technological dynamics, the vast build-up in forces, the colossal mismatch in resources. And what Ukraine ought to be doing, logically, is to seek peace, perhaps to go onto the defensive and to seek peace. But Zelensky, for his own reasons, has picked the general who is most likely to do the opposite. Anyway, that's the situation with Zaluzhny and Zelensky. I'm not going to go into a detailed account of the situation in the battlefronts. As I said, in the situation in Avdiivka, getting worse, as I said, by the hour. There have been very few reports from other parts of the battlefronts as well, but everything that I'm hearing suggests that the trends that have been apparent over the last few weeks of the Russians gaining the initiative, advancing, inflicting massive losses on Ukraine, that all of that continues and won't change. What I will do briefly is touch on the incredibly baroque politics that happen in the United States. Now, yesterday, before I did my program, when I did my program, I was speaking about how the Senate had actually voted 59 to 49 against the omnibus package that Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell had agreed, which would have provided some funding for the border and all the funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel that the Biden administration was seeking. And I said that the fact that the Senate had rejected this omnibus package made it seem to me most unlikely that the new plan that Chuck Schumer has come up with to separate the issue of funding for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan from the border question. I couldn't see how that would work, given that the Republicans themselves have, in the past, insisted on the linkage between providing this funding and sorting out the problem on the border. Now, what then happened in the hours after I made my video is that Chuck Schumer's package went to the Senate and it won 2 procedural votes, one by, I understand, 58 to 43, the other by 67 to 32. And it remains under discussion, but my view continues to be that eventually, most likely, it will probably fail. I cannot be certain of this because any predictions about what the US Congress is likely to do, I personally find extremely difficult. I am not an expert in the complexities and of American parliamentary politics. I know that there's armies of lobbyists, no doubt, busy. There's a huge amount of arms twisting, no doubt, going on. There'll be many, many attempts to get wavering Republicans to change their stance and to back this package. And of course, it's important to say that if there were a straight vote on funding for Ukraine in Congress, there are probably large majorities to provide that funding, both in the Senate and in the House. However, 32 Republicans voted against this package in the second vote. That is twice as many as voted for it. And I'm assuming that most of the Republicans who voted for it would have been people who are basically loyal to Mitch McConnell and his priorities, which he's made clear in the past, are very much to support Ukraine. And the fact that 32 Republicans in the Senate voted against this package, I would have thought makes it most unlikely that this package will in the end succeed and will pass the House, at least in this form. I would have thought that with Republicans in the House, with Speaker Johnson, having created this linkage between funding for the border and funding for all of these other causes. The tide of opinion amongst Republicans is now so strong that it's unlikely that Johnson would be prepared to put a package like this to the House. It doesn't fulfill his initial demands, and as he said himself, putting aside the question of the border, which is of course of imperative importance for Republicans in electoral terms, the administration has anyway failed to provide a clear pathway of what it intends to do in Ukraine. And given this, I think there will be a discussion in the Senate. I think there will be eventually some kind of an agreement, or at least a vote on a package, a final vote on a package from the Senate. It will probably happen sometime this month, but then I suspect that Johnson will reject it. That's my guess. If that is what happens, then of course American funding for Ukraine ends, and to all intents and purposes, the war in Ukraine will have been finally decided, because without economic and military support for Ukraine, it is impossible for Ukraine to continue the war. If, however, I am wrong and the Republicans in the House are brought round in some form, perhaps a package is put together, perhaps a smaller one than the one we've seen, despite all the ructions and anger that this would cause amongst many Republicans in the country and on Donald Trump's part, and despite the anger that there would be amongst many Republicans in the House. But let's assume that some kind of a package is put together. Well, American support for Ukraine will still continue, but the United States has run out of shells to supply to Ukraine in the quantities that Ukraine needs. And the outcome anyway is not going to change, because the Russians have built up forces that it is clear are now overwhelming. And there is no practical way whereby the United States or its European allies can redress the difference. It would be a classic case of throwing good money after bad. But in the United States, people sometimes do that. And perhaps, though I doubt it this time, but perhaps they'll do it again. Well, this is where I finish my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. No doubt we'll be getting more news from the battlefronts, and also no doubt from the Middle East. And we will see where all these two wars are going. And we will see what General Syrsky does with Avdiivka, whether he does indeed reinforce failure and sacrifice the lives of tens of thousands more Ukrainian soldiers, and if so, what effect that, on top of the anger caused by his appointment, will cause in Ukraine. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Just to remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, links under this video also. There's still a sale going on, 15% discount on shirts. And in the meantime, as I said, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you once more. Have a very good day. More from me soon.